The screams from Cranberry Wilderness. Have you ever heard a human scream echoing through a forest where no human could possibly survive? What if that scream wasn't asking for help, but was trying to lure you deeper into the darkness? Before we begin tonight's story, welcome back to the channel. If you're fascinated by true horror, forgotten legends, unexplained disappearances, haunted forests, and terrifying stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare, you're in the right place. Every week, we explore chilling tales inspired by mysterious places across America, stories that may leave you thinking twice before your next hike. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and remember, some sounds are never meant to be followed. Cranberry Wilderness, West Virginia. Over 47,000 acres of endless mountains, ancient hardwood forests, hidden valleys, and abandoned logging roads stretched beneath an almost permanent blanket of mist. Rangers often described it as one of the wildest places remaining in the eastern United States. Cell service disappeared only a few miles from the parking areas. GPS signals drifted unpredictably beneath the thick canopy, and the weather could transform from peaceful sunshine into dense fog in less than an hour. Most visitors came searching for silence. Some left believing they had found something else. Among experienced hikers, there was an old saying rarely spoken around newcomers. If you hear someone screaming in the middle of Cranberry Wilderness, keep walking. Nobody ever explained why. Most assumed it was simply another local ghost story designed to scare tourists. Others knew better. It was late October when 5 friends decided to spend an entire weekend backpacking through the Cranberry Wilderness. The leaves had already turned brilliant shades of crimson, gold, and burnt orange. Every gust of wind sent thousands of leaves swirling through the cold mountain air like dying embers. The group had spent months planning the trip. Ryan, 29, was the leader. He had hiked hundreds of miles across the Appalachian Mountains and believed preparation solved every problem. Emily carried the maps. She trusted paper more than electronics and always packed 2 compasses. Mark documented every adventure with an expensive camera. His dream was to film America's forgotten wilderness before it disappeared forever. Sarah worked as an emergency room nurse and had joined mostly to escape the constant pressure of city life. Then there was Noah. Unlike the others, Noah had almost canceled. 3 nights before the trip, he had dreamed about standing in an unfamiliar forest while someone screamed his name over and over from somewhere beyond the trees. Every time he tried to run toward the voice, the forest grew larger. The scream became farther away. When he finally reached the place where the sound came from, he woke up gasping for breath. He laughed it off. Everyone has strange dreams before traveling, right? The morning they entered Cranberry Wilderness felt unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. The parking lot held only 3 other vehicles despite it being the perfect weekend for hiking. A weathered wooden sign stood beside the trailhead. Welcome to Cranberry Wilderness. Below it, someone had scratched fresh words into the wood using a knife. Don't follow the screams. Ryan rolled his eyes. Teenagers. Mark raised his camera. Actually, that's kind of creepy. Emily frowned. The cuts look recent. Sarah looked around the parking area. Anybody else notice something? What? There aren't any ranger vehicles. Ryan shrugged. They're probably busy. Noah couldn't stop staring at the warning. Something about the handwriting bothered him. The letters looked uneven. Not carved carefully. More like someone had been shaking violently while writing them. The first few miles passed peacefully. Golden sunlight filtered through towering oaks and maples. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine needles. Tiny streams crossed the trail every few hundred yards. Mark photographed everything. Mushrooms growing from fallen logs. Spiderwebs sparkling with morning dew. An abandoned railroad grade hidden beneath moss. Old stone foundations from logging camps that had vanished nearly a century earlier. Every image looked postcard perfect. By early afternoon they reached a clearing overlooking endless waves of Appalachian forest stretching toward distant blue mountains. Ryan smiled. Worth every mile. Emily unfolded her map. We'll camp near the creek another 3 miles from here. Everyone agreed. No one noticed that the woods around them had become completely silent. Not one bird. Not one squirrel. Not even insects. Only the wind. Around 4 in the afternoon, Sarah stopped walking. Did you hear that? Everyone froze. What? I thought. She hesitated. Never mind. Ryan continued hiking. Probably a deer. Or branches rubbing together. 10 minutes later, it came again. A scream. A woman's scream. Long. Desperate. Echoing somewhere far beyond the trees. The sound lasted only 3 seconds. Then silence. The 5 hikers stared at each other. Emily spoke first. That sounded real. Ryan nodded slowly. Maybe another hiking group. Sarah shook her head. No. Why not? That wasn't someone calling for help. Everyone looked at her. She swallowed. I hear people scream at the hospital. She paused. That sounded different. Mark tried laughing. Different how? She couldn't explain. Because deep inside? It had sounded less like someone in pain. And more like someone trying very hard to sound human. Ryan removed his GPS. The signal says the scream came northeast. Emily immediately disagreed. No way. What? I heard it west. Mark looked confused. I thought it came from behind us. Noah stared into the trees. It was ahead. Silence settled over the group. Every one of them had heard the same scream. Yet every one of them believed it had come from a completely different direction. Ryan forced a smile. Echoes. Nobody answered. 20 minutes later, the scream returned. Closer. Much closer. This time it lasted almost 10 seconds. Help. The voice cracked through the forest. Please. Then came sobbing. Real sobbing. Raw. Terrified. Human. Sarah immediately reached for her first aid pack. We have to find them. Emily hesitated. Wait. Ryan was already turning off the trail. If someone's hurt, we don't have a choice. The others reluctantly followed. Only Noah remained standing on the path. His stomach tightened. His dream. The voice. The trees. Every detail suddenly felt horribly familiar. He whispered to himself. This is wrong. Then, somewhere deep in the forest, a third scream echoed. This time, it called his name. Noah. The voice sounded exactly like his younger sister. Except, she had been dead for almost 12 years. Noah's blood turned to ice. He looked at the others. None of them reacted. They kept walking toward the sound as though they hadn't heard his name at all. Noah. Ryan looked back. You coming? He stared once more into the impossibly dark forest. Something moved between the trees. Not an animal. Not a person. Just a silhouette. Standing perfectly still. Watching them. And then, it smiled. Ryan never saw the figure standing between the trees. By the time Noah blinked, it had vanished, swallowed completely by the dense wall of oak and hemlock. Only the darkness remained, perfectly still, as though nothing had ever been there. Noah opened his mouth to warn the others, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he had seen? A shadow with a smile was hardly enough to convince 4 experienced hikers to turn around. Before he could gather his thoughts, another scream shattered the silence. It was so piercing that it seemed to vibrate through the trunks themselves. Help me, the voice cried. Please, don't leave me here. Sarah instinctively ran toward the sound, forcing branches aside as she disappeared into the undergrowth. Ryan cursed under his breath and hurried after her. Emily and Mark exchanged uneasy glances before following, leaving Noah standing alone for only a second before fear of being abandoned outweighed every instinct telling him to stay on the trail. The forest changed almost immediately. The well-maintained hiking path disappeared behind them within a matter of yards, replaced by tangled roots, moss-covered rocks, and fallen logs that forced them to climb and crawl rather than walk. The sunlight that had warmed the trail only minutes earlier faded into an unnatural gray gloom beneath the thick canopy. Although it was still late afternoon, it felt as if evening had arrived hours ahead of schedule. The temperature dropped sharply. Each breath became visible in the cold air. Ryan checked his GPS while pushing through a cluster of mountain laurel. That's strange. Emily looked over his shoulder. What is it? It says we're still standing on the trail. She frowned. We're obviously not. Ryan tapped the screen several times. The tiny arrow representing their location refused to move, even as they continued hiking deeper into the woods. It must have frozen. Mark pulled out his own handheld GPS. So did mine. The display showed something even stranger. Instead of roads, rivers, or contour lines, the screen displayed nothing but a pale gray background. The map itself had disappeared. What the hell? Emily immediately unfolded her paper map. We'll be fine. We don't need electronics. She spread the map across a fallen log and aligned it with her compass. For several long seconds she stared at the needle. Then she slowly looked up. My compass isn't working. Ryan laughed nervously. Compasses don't just stop working. Emily handed it to him. The needle spun endlessly in slow circles without ever pointing north. Sarah pulled another compass from her emergency kit. It did exactly the same thing. Noah reached into his pocket and removed the small brass compass his grandfather had given him years earlier. Unlike the others, its needle wasn't spinning. It pointed steadily, directly behind them, toward the trail they had left. The instant Noah noticed this, the compass needle snapped violently in the opposite direction with enough force to make the tiny glass cover rattle. Then it began rotating wildly like the others. It's broken too, he whispered. No one answered. Another scream echoed through the trees. This time it sounded much weaker, as if the person had almost lost the strength to call for help. Sarah started walking faster. We're close. Ryan nodded. Keep moving. Yet despite the scream sounding closer every time, they never seemed to gain any ground. The voice remained just beyond the next ridge, just beyond the next stand of trees, always close enough to encourage them forward but never close enough to reveal its source. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. The terrain grew steeper. Massive boulders appeared where the map showed none. Twisted trees leaned over the hillside like crooked hands reaching toward the hikers. Their branches intertwined so tightly that they blocked almost every ray of sunlight. Thick curtains of moss hung from the limbs despite the elevation being too high for such growth. Mark raised his camera. I've never seen trees like these. He snapped several photographs. The flash briefly illuminated the woods. Something moved behind the nearest trunk. A tall figure crossed the frame faster than humanly possible. Mark lowered the camera. Did anybody else? What? I thought I saw. He hesitated. Nothing. He looked down to review the image. His face turned pale. Instead of the forest, every photograph showed only darkness. Not blurry. Not underexposed. Pure black. Except for 5 tiny white shapes. They resembled faces. Floating in the darkness. Each face stared directly into the camera. Mark zoomed in. The features remained impossible to identify. No eyes. No noses. Only mouths stretched open in silent screams. His hands began to shake. I'm deleting these. Before he could press the button, every image disappeared from the memory card by itself. The screen displayed only one message. No files found. Clouds rolled overhead, darkening the forest even further. Ryan checked his watch. That's impossible. Emily looked up. What? It says we've only been hiking for 18 minutes. Sarah stopped walking. No. We left the trail over an hour ago. Ryan turned the watch toward her. The second hand ticked normally. The digital clock read 4:23 p.m. Emily checked her own watch. It read 6:11 p.m. Mark's read 11:58 a.m. Noah's displayed nothing except flashing zeros. None of them spoke. 5 people. 5 different times. As though time itself had become lost among the trees. The screaming stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing against their ears until even their breathing sounded unnaturally loud. Sarah looked around. Where did they go? Ryan cupped his hands around his mouth. Hello? No answer. If anyone can hear us. Nothing. Even their echoes failed to return. Emily slowly turned in a full circle. I don't like this. Noah noticed something that made his stomach knot. The wind had stopped. Every leaf hung perfectly motionless. Not a single branch swayed. The entire forest had frozen. Then, crunch. A footstep. Behind them. They spun around. Nothing. Crunch. This time from their left. Ryan swung his flashlight toward the sound. Only trees. Crunch. Now from their right. The footsteps circled them. Slowly. Methodically. Always remaining just outside the reach of their lights. Mark whispered, "It's following us." Another step. Then another. Soon there were dozens. No. Hundreds. Invisible feet walking through dead leaves all around them. Some heavy. Some light. Some dragging as though whatever made them could barely move. Yet despite the overwhelming sound, not a single leaf stirred. The footsteps existed without anything actually walking. Sarah backed toward the center of the group. "We need to leave." Ryan nodded. "Everyone stay together." Emily unfolded the map once more. Her heart nearly stopped. The map was blank. Every trail. Every river. Every contour line. Every landmark. Gone. The only thing remaining was a single sentence written across the empty paper in faded black ink. "You should have kept walking." Before anyone could react, the scream returned. Not from somewhere ahead. Not from behind. It came from every direction at once. Hundreds of voices. Men. Women. Children. All crying for help in perfect unison. And beneath those desperate screams, something laughed. The laughter rolled through the trees like distant thunder, low at first, then growing louder until it seemed to vibrate beneath their boots. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It carried no amusement, no emotion that could be recognized as human. It sounded ancient, patient, and impossibly deep, as though the entire forest itself had learned how to laugh after centuries of listening to people scream. The chorus of desperate voices abruptly stopped, leaving only that horrifying sound echoing between the hills. Then, just as suddenly, the laughter faded into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Ryan slowly swept his flashlight across the surrounding woods. Every trunk, every branch, every patch of moss appeared perfectly ordinary, yet something about the forest had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded. Noah couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that dozens of unseen eyes were fixed upon them from every direction. Every instinct screamed that they were no longer alone. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he forced himself to look deeper into the darkness beyond the flashlight's beam. There. For only a fraction of a second. A pale face appeared between two enormous hemlock trees. It was far too high above the ground. At least 15 feet. The face didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It simply stared. Then it slid sideways behind the trunk without making the slightest movement of its body, as though it had been pulled away by invisible hands. "No." Noah whispered. "What?" Sarah asked. "I saw someone." "Where?" He pointed toward the trees. When everyone turned their lights in that direction, they found nothing except rough bark covered in emerald green moss. Ryan sighed. "You're imagining things." Before Noah could answer, Emily interrupted. "No." Her voice trembled. "I saw it too." Ryan looked from Noah to Emily. "What exactly did you see?" Emily swallowed hard. "A face." Mark slowly raised his camera again. "I'm recording everything from now on." The tiny red recording light blinked to life. "Maybe if something's out there, the camera will catch it." Ryan didn't argue. At this point, none of them trusted their own eyes anymore. The group continued walking, choosing what they believed was the direction back toward the official trail. Ryan led the way, breaking branches with his trekking pole to leave obvious markers behind them. "If we get turned around," he explained, "we'll just follow the broken branches." It sounded reasonable. Comforting, even. For nearly 20 minutes, they marched downhill through dense undergrowth without hearing another scream. The silence became almost reassuring. Then Ryan suddenly stopped. "No." Everyone crowded beside him. Directly ahead stood a freshly broken branch. Its splintered wood gleamed bright against the dark bark. Ryan frowned. "I broke that." Emily looked around. "So?" Ryan pointed farther ahead. "And that one." Another broken branch. Then another. And another. They weren't discovering their trail back. They had somehow walked in a perfect circle. Mark shook his head. "That's impossible." Ryan looked behind them. His face drained of color. Every broken branch had vanished. Only the ones in front of them remained. It was as though the forest had erased the path behind them while preserving the path ahead. Sarah whispered, "The woods don't want us leaving." Nobody laughed. Darkness settled rapidly. The last traces of daylight disappeared beneath thick clouds that had silently gathered overhead. Ryan distributed spare flashlights while Emily suggested making camp until morning. "We're exhausted," she said. "If we keep wandering, we'll only make things worse." Ryan reluctantly agreed. They found a relatively flat clearing surrounded by ancient spruce trees whose trunks were wider than pickup trucks. The ground was unnaturally free of rocks and fallen branches, almost as though someone had cleaned it long ago. Mark glanced around uneasily. "Doesn't this seem too perfect?" Noah nodded. "It looks like someone expected us." No one replied. Within minutes, they pitched their tents and gathered dead wood for a fire. Oddly enough, despite the damp forest floor, every stick they picked up was perfectly dry. Ryan struck a lighter. The fire ignited immediately. Warm orange light pushed back the darkness, giving everyone a brief sense of safety. Sarah handed around protein bars and bottled water. Nobody had much of an appetite. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. No insects. No owls. No distant coyotes. Nothing. Only the crackling fire. About an hour later, Mark was reviewing the footage he'd recorded while the others rested. He frowned. "Guys." Ryan looked over. "What now? I don't remember filming this." The others gathered around the small camera screen. The video began with the group walking through the forest exactly as they remembered. Then the image flickered. Static covered the screen for less than a second. When the picture returned, there were 6 hikers. Not 5. The unknown figure walked at the very back of the line. Tall, thin, wrapped in dark clothing. Its head hung forward so its face couldn't be seen. No one had noticed it while hiking. The camera had. Mark's breathing quickened. I swear there were only 5 of us." Ryan grabbed the camera. The figure continued following them. Step after silent step. Always maintaining the same distance. Never approaching. Never falling behind. Then, halfway through the recording, the figure slowly lifted its head. The screen filled with static before anyone could see its face. When the image cleared again, the 6th hiker was gone. Mark rewound the footage. The same thing happened every time. Static. The head lifting. Then nothing. Emily looked at everyone. "Delete it." Mark hesitated. "No. If we get out of here, people need to see this." Ryan handed the camera back without speaking. The fire burned lower as midnight approached, or at least what they believed was midnight. Their watches still disagreed. Ryan volunteered for the first watch while the others tried to sleep. Noah lay inside his tent, staring at the ceiling. Sleep never came. Instead, he heard whispering. At first it sounded like the wind moving through leaves. Soft. Almost impossible to understand. Then individual words became clear. "Noah." He froze. The whisper came from outside the tent. "Come here." His heart pounded. It was his sister's voice again. Exactly as he remembered it from childhood. Gentle. Warm. Impossible. Tears filled his eyes before he even realized they had begun. "You left me?" "No. You promised you'd never leave me alone." His hands trembled. He knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet every memory, every emotion, every ounce of grief he'd carried for 12 years came flooding back. The zipper of his tent slowly began to slide downward. Not quickly. Not violently. Slowly. As though someone outside was carefully opening it. Noah held his breath. The zipper stopped halfway. A freezing gust of air entered the tent. Then came another whisper. "I'm waiting." Against every instinct, Noah looked toward the opening. 2 pale fingers curled around the edge of the tent flap. They looked almost human. Almost. The joints were far too long. The fingernails resembled black animal claws. The skin was stretched so tightly over the bones that it appeared ready to split. The fingers slowly pulled the flap wider. A face began to emerge from the darkness beyond. Its eyes reflected the dying campfire like those of a predator lurking just outside the light. Before Noah could scream, a deafening gunshot exploded somewhere deep within the forest. The face vanished instantly. Outside, Ryan shouted at the top of his lungs. "Everybody wake up!" The camp erupted into chaos as another gunshot echoed through Cranberry Wilderness. Followed by the unmistakable sound of someone running through the trees toward their campsite. Noah burst from his tent just as the second gunshot echoed through the mountains. The cold night air hit him like a wall, carrying with it the sharp smell of gunpowder and damp earth. Ryan stood near the edge of the camp with his flashlight aimed into the darkness, his entire body rigid. Emily and Sarah emerged only seconds later, while Mark stumbled out clutching his camera, still trying to switch it into recording mode. "Who fired that?" Ryan shouted. No one answered. The beam from his flashlight cut through the trees, but beyond 20 yards the forest swallowed the light completely. The darkness felt unnaturally dense, almost solid, as though it were pushing back against the artificial glow. Then they heard it. Heavy footsteps. Someone was sprinting directly toward their campsite. Branches snapped. Leaves scattered. Whoever, or whatever, it was moved with desperate speed, crashing through the forest without any attempt to stay quiet. Sarah instinctively stepped backward. Oh God! A figure burst through the trees. A man. He collapsed only a few feet from the fire, gasping for breath. His gray beard was tangled with leaves and mud. His faded green jacket hung in shredded strips, exposing dozens of fresh scratches across his arms. One hiking boot was missing entirely, and blood soaked the sock covering his left foot. Ryan rushed forward. "Easy, easy. You're safe." The old man grabbed Ryan's jacket with surprising strength. "No," he rasped. His eyes were wild with terror. "You are not safe." The group exchanged nervous glances. Emily knelt beside him. "What happened to you?" The man looked over each of their shoulders as if expecting something to emerge from the trees at any moment. "How many are you?" "5," Ryan answered. The old man's face drained of color. "There were 6. Silence. Ryan frowned. "What? I counted 6 of you." "No. There are only 5. The old man slowly shook his head. "Not anymore." Noah felt every muscle in his body tighten. Mark instinctively turned his camera toward the stranger. "Who are you?" "My name is Walter." His breathing remained ragged. "I've been trying to get out of these woods for—" He stopped speaking. His brow furrowed. "I don't know." Emily handed him a bottle of water. "How long have you been here?" Walter stared at the bottle for several seconds before answering. "I came here on a weekend fishing trip." "When?" He looked up at the sky as though searching for the answer among the stars. "October." Ryan nodded. "Yeah. It's October now." Walter slowly lowered the bottle. "No." He whispered the next words. "October, 1998. No one spoke. Mark forced an uneasy laugh. "That's impossible." Walter ignored him. "I parked my truck at the northern trailhead." Ryan swallowed. "That parking area closed 20 years ago." Walter blinked. "What? It doesn't exist anymore." The old man looked as though someone had struck him. His breathing became shallow. "No." He looked around the campfire. "No." His voice cracked. "I've only been here." He paused. 3 days. Ryan helped Walter sit beside the fire while Sarah cleaned the cuts covering his arms. None of them knew what to believe. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, yet his driver's license, though faded and cracked, identified him as 53 years old. Issued in 1998. Expired in 2002. Emily quietly examined the card beneath her flashlight. "It's real." Ryan looked toward Walter. "Do you have any family?" "My wife." He smiled weakly. "She's waiting for me back home." Sarah hesitated. "What city?" "Richwood." Emily slowly lowered the license. "I hate to ask this." Walter looked at her. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" "Friday morning." Emily's eyes filled with sympathy. "Today is Friday." Walter nodded. "No." She struggled to find the words. "It's Friday? 28 years later." Walter stared at her. Then he laughed. A short, confused laugh. "You think I'm crazy." Nobody answered. His smile slowly disappeared. "You don't. Do you?" The campfire suddenly crackled violently. Every flame leaned toward the forest. Not with the wind. Against it. Walter's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened in absolute horror. "They found us." Ryan looked around. "Who?" Walter stood so abruptly that he nearly fell over. "We have to put the fire out." "Why?" "It lets them see us." Ryan hesitated. "What are you talking about?" Walter grabbed a bucket of water and threw it into the flames without waiting for permission. Steam exploded into the air. Darkness consumed the campsite. Only their flashlights remained. Walter whispered frantically. "Turn them off." Ryan frowned. "We'll be blind." Walter looked directly into his eyes. They can see light. A long silence followed. One by one, the flashlights clicked off. The forest became pitch black. No moonlight reached the ground beneath the dense canopy. No stars pierced the clouds. The darkness was complete. Noah had never experienced anything like it. He couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. Then, something enormous inhaled. The sound came from somewhere beyond the trees. Slow. Deep. Like lungs the size of a house drawing in air. Another inhale answered from farther away. Then another. And another. The forest wasn't occupied by a single creature. It was filled with them. No one dared speak above a whisper. Walter leaned close. They don't hunt with their eyes. Ryan whispered back. Then how? They listen. Emily barely breathed. What are they? Walter's reply came after several long seconds. I don't know. I've never seen one clearly. Anyone who does. He swallowed. Doesn't come back. Mark quietly reached for his camera. Even in complete darkness, the infrared mode could still record. He pressed the record button. The tiny screen glowed faintly red. He slowly turned the camera toward the trees. At first, nothing. Only dark trunks. Then shapes began appearing. 1, 5, 10, 20, hundreds. Tall silhouettes stood motionless among the trees. Each one was impossibly thin. Their limbs were far too long. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles. None of them moved. They simply watched the tiny camp through the darkness. Mark's breathing became uneven. He zoomed in. The nearest figure stood no more than 30 feet away. Its body resembled black bark more than flesh. Its arms reached almost to the ground. Its face didn't have one. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. There was only smooth gray skin. Then, as if sensing the camera, every head turned toward Mark simultaneously. The movement was perfectly synchronized. Hundreds of necks twisting at the exact same moment. The camera emitted a loud electronic beep. Battery low. The sound echoed through the silent forest. Walter's eyes widened. No. The beeping continued. Beep, beep, beep. Every shadow in the forest froze. Then, one by one, the creatures opened mouths that hadn't been there a second earlier. Their faces split vertically from forehead to throat, revealing rows of needle-like teeth glistening in the darkness. None of them screamed. Not yet. Instead, they smiled. Walter whispered the words that would haunt every one of them forever. Don't let them hear you breathe. At that exact moment, one of the creatures took its first step into the campsite. The creature moved with a slow, deliberate grace that no living animal should possess. It didn't stumble over roots or push aside branches. Instead, it seemed to glide between the trees, its unnaturally long limbs bending at impossible angles as though its bones had never been meant for the shape they occupied. The silence surrounding it was even more terrifying than its appearance. No footsteps. No rustling leaves. No snapping twigs. The forest itself seemed unwilling to acknowledge that the thing existed. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Walter's warning echoed inside Noah's mind like a prayer. Don't let them hear you breathe. The creature stopped just outside the abandoned campsite. Its split face slowly closed until no trace of its mouth remained. Smooth gray skin covered its features once more. It tilted its head as if listening to something hidden beneath the earth. Another creature emerged from the darkness. Then another. Soon nearly a dozen of the towering figures surrounded the clearing, forming a perfect circle around the 5 hikers and the old man. They remained absolutely still, like silent judges deciding the fate of intruders. Ryan could feel his lungs burning. Every instinct demanded that he inhale. His chest tightened painfully. Beside him, Sarah pressed both hands over her mouth to suppress even the slightest sound. Mark's camera continued recording. The infrared display revealed something their eyes could not. The creatures were not looking at the campers. They were looking beyond them. Toward the center of the campsite. Toward the spot where the campfire had burned only minutes before. As though they were waiting for someone, or something, to emerge from the ashes. Several agonizing seconds passed. Then one of the creatures suddenly raised its head toward the sky. The others followed. In perfect synchronization, every faceless being looked upward. A distant scream drifted across the mountains. It was the same desperate cry they had followed earlier that day. Except now it sounded miles away. Another scream answered from the opposite direction. Then another. Soon the entire wilderness echoed with cries for help. Hundreds of voices. Men begging for mercy. Women screaming in terror. Children calling for their parents. The horrifying chorus rolled endlessly through the valleys, bouncing from ridge to ridge until it became impossible to tell where any of the voices originated. The creatures remained motionless. Listening. Noah realized something horrifying. The screams were not calling the hikers. They were giving directions. The creatures were communicating. Walter slowly leaned toward Ryan until his lips were almost touching Ryan's ear. "They're counting." Ryan frowned. "What?" "The screams." Walter's voice was barely audible. "They're counting us." Ryan stared at him in confusion. Walter continued. "They don't attack immediately. They make sure no one escapes." Emily's heartbeat pounded so loudly she feared the creatures would hear it. "How do you know?" Walter's eyes never left the monsters. "Because I've watched them do it before." Noah slowly turned toward him. "Before?" Walter nodded once. "There were 4 of us." His voice cracked. "My brother, my son, and my best friend." He swallowed hard. "We heard the screaming. We followed it. Just like you." His eyes filled with tears. "I was the only one who came back." Sarah whispered, "What happened to them?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the towering figures surrounding the clearing. Then he pointed at the tallest one standing between 2 enormous spruce trees. "That's my brother." The blood drained from everyone's face. Walter shifted his finger toward another creature. "And that's my son." Ryan stared at the impossible silhouettes. "You can recognize them?" Walter slowly shook his head. "No. They told me." Nobody understood. Walter continued. "They mimic voices. They mimic memories. And eventually, they learn your name." Mark's camera suddenly flickered. Static covered the screen. The battery indicator jumped from 2% to 100%. Without warning, the camera switched itself into playback mode. "No," Mark whispered. "I didn't touch anything." The recording began playing automatically. But it wasn't the footage he had captured earlier. The timestamp displayed on the screen read, October 14, 1998. Walter froze. His hands began trembling uncontrollably. "No." The image showed 4 hikers walking through brilliant autumn leaves. A younger Walter laughed as he adjusted his backpack. Beside him walked a teenage boy carrying a fishing rod. His son. The hikers watched in stunned silence. The old recording continued. The younger group heard a scream. They stopped. Just as Ryan's group had done. Walter covered his mouth. "Oh God?" The footage showed the 4 hikers leaving the marked trail. Every step mirrored what Ryan's group had done that afternoon. The same fallen log. The same creek. The same twisted trees. The same mistake. Mark whispered, "How is this possible?" Nobody answered. The camera continued playing. The younger hikers eventually reached a campsite. Exactly the same campsite where Ryan's group now stood. Every tree matched. Every rock. Every stump. Even the arrangement of their tents had been identical. The only difference. The younger campsite had 6 people. Ryan frowned. There were only 4. Walter stared at the screen. No. There were 4. The camera clearly showed 6. 2 additional figures moved silently among the campers. Neither seemed to notice them. The hidden figures simply watched. Waiting. Learning. Following. Just as one had followed Ryan's group earlier. Noah's pulse quickened. What if? He hesitated. What if those things don't just hunt people? Emily looked at him. What do you mean? What if they join us first? The playback ended abruptly. The screen went black. Then words slowly appeared in white letters. You brought them home. Mark dropped the camera. It struck the ground with a sharp crack. Instantly, every creature surrounding the clearing lifted its head. The forest became deathly still. No screams. No wind. No insects. Only silence. One creature took another step forward. Then another. The circle tightened. Ryan slowly reached for the flare gun attached to his backpack. Walter grabbed his wrist. Don't. If they hear it? Ryan whispered desperately, then what do we do? Walter looked around at the closing ring of faceless beings. His answer came in a broken whisper. We pray that they're here for someone else. Before anyone could respond, a branch snapped behind Noah. He turned. Standing at the very edge of the campsite, illuminated by the faint glow of Mark's shattered camera screen, was another Noah. It wore the same jacket, the same backpack, the same frightened expression. It smiled. Then, in Noah's own voice, it quietly said, "You should run." At that exact instant, every creature in the clearing screamed. The sound was so impossibly loud that the ground itself trembled beneath their feet. The scream struck them like a physical force. Noah dropped to one knee, both hands clamped over his ears as waves of unbearable pain exploded inside his skull. Ryan stumbled backward into a fallen log, his vision blurring as blood trickled from one ear. Emily cried out, but even her own voice was swallowed beneath the deafening chorus. Sarah collapsed beside Walter, unable to tell whether she was screaming or only imagining it. The forest itself seemed to recoil. Leaves ripped from the branches as though caught in the wake of an invisible explosion. Dead limbs snapped from towering trees and crashed to the ground. Loose stones vibrated violently, bouncing across the forest floor. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. An unnatural silence settled over the wilderness. The ringing inside their ears remained. No one spoke. No one could. For several terrifying seconds, they could hear nothing at all. Only the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Noah slowly lifted his head. The second Noah was gone. The creatures surrounding the campsite had disappeared. Every one of them. Only the empty forest remained. Ryan looked around in disbelief. Where? His own voice sounded distant, muffled, as though he were speaking underwater. They're gone. Walter didn't look relieved. He looked terrified. No. He whispered. This is worse. Emily steadied herself against a tree. What do you mean? Walter stared into the darkness. They only leave when something bigger arrives. A cold wind swept through the clearing. Unlike every breeze they had felt since entering the wilderness, this one carried an odor. Rotting leaves. Wet stone. Stagnant water. And beneath it all, the unmistakable scent of decay. Not the smell of a dead animal. The smell of something that had been dead. For a very long time. Sarah instinctively covered her nose. What is that? Walter closed his eyes. I prayed we'd never smell it again. Ryan tightened the straps on his backpack. We're leaving. Now. Nobody argued. Within moments they had packed only the essentials, abandoning tents, sleeping bags, cookware, and most of their supplies. Nothing mattered except finding the trail. Finding civilization. Finding anywhere that wasn't here. Emily unfolded the paper map one final time. The horrifying message, "You should have kept walking," had vanished. The trails had returned. So had the rivers and contour lines. Ryan let out a relieved breath. It's back. Emily traced their location with trembling fingers. No. Her voice cracked. This can't be right. What? She slowly turned the map toward the others. The symbol marking their position was no longer inside Cranberry Wilderness. According to the map, they were standing in a place labeled only. No survey data available. Beyond that point, the paper was completely blank. Not white. Gray. As though whoever printed the map had intentionally refused to record what lay beyond that invisible boundary. Walter quietly folded the map shut. There are no maps here. There never were. The group began walking downhill. Ryan marked trees with bright orange survival tape every few yards. Unlike the broken branches earlier, the tape would be impossible to miss. At least, that was the plan. 20 minutes later, Mark suddenly stopped. Ryan. What? Mark pointed toward a nearby tree. A strip of bright orange tape fluttered from its trunk. Ryan frowned. I just tied that. Emily looked around. So did we just walk in another circle? Ryan shook his head. No. He walked closer. The tape wasn't tied. It had grown through the bark. The tree had completely absorbed it. As if decades had passed since he had placed it there. He reached out and touched the faded fabric. It crumbled into dust between his fingers. Noah stared at the trunk. Fresh bark had formed around the remains of the tape. The tree looked at least 50 years older. Ryan stepped back. I put that there 20 minutes ago. Walter spoke quietly. Not for the forest. No one said another word. The realization settled over them like ice. Time wasn't flowing normally anymore. Not here. Not beyond the invisible line on the map. Minutes for them. Could be years for the wilderness. Or perhaps, years for them. Were only minutes for something else. The terrain became increasingly unfamiliar. Ancient stone walls appeared among the trees. Perfectly straight. Perfectly built. Yet no trail guide had ever mentioned ruins inside Cranberry Wilderness. The walls stretched for hundreds of feet before disappearing beneath moss. Nearby stood the remains of a rusted iron gate. Its hinges had fused solid long ago. An unreadable wooden sign lay broken at its base. Mark brushed away centuries of moss. Only a few letters remained visible. Cranberry Research. The rest had rotted away. Ryan frowned. Research? Emily shook her head. There was never a research station here. Walter's expression darkened. There wasn't supposed to be. They squeezed through the broken gateway. Beyond it, the forest changed again. The trees stood unnaturally straight, forming almost perfect rows. The undergrowth disappeared. The ground became smooth, covered in thick black needles instead of leaves. Even the air felt different. Heavier. Every sound seemed strangely muted. Sarah suddenly stopped walking. Listen. Everyone froze. At first, nothing. Then, a faint mechanical hum. Ryan frowned. Generators? No. Emily tilted her head. It sounds electrical. The humming grew louder with every step. Soon they began finding rusted metal objects scattered beneath the trees. Coils of thick cable. Broken glass insulators. Fragments of concrete foundations. The remains of utility poles swallowed by enormous roots. Noah picked up a corroded metal plate. Most of the lettering had rusted away. Only 3 words remained readable. Authorized personnel only. Mark slowly turned his camera. If this place existed, why isn't it on any map? Nobody answered. Because everyone was wondering the same thing. The humming abruptly stopped. Complete silence returned. Then, a bright white light flickered between the trees. Once. Twice. 3 times. It looked like fluorescent lighting. Deep inside a forest where electricity should have been impossible. Ryan cautiously approached. The others followed several yards behind. As they rounded a cluster of ancient spruce trees, every one of them froze. Hidden beneath vines and decades of overgrowth stood a massive concrete building embedded directly into the side of the mountain. Its walls were cracked. Its windows were shattered. The roof had partially collapsed beneath towering trees that had grown through the structure. Yet one thing remained impossible to explain. Behind one broken window, a fluorescent light flickered on. Someone, or something, had just turned it on. Walter's face turned as white as the fog drifting across the clearing. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I've seen that building before. Ryan looked at him. You have? Walter nodded slowly. I found it. The first night I got lost. His eyes never left the broken window. I went inside. A long silence followed. Emily finally asked the question everyone feared. What did you find? Walter swallowed. I don't remember. He looked genuinely confused. I remember opening the door. I remember hearing people talking. I remember someone saying. He pressed both hands against his temples, struggling to force the memory back. Then his eyes widened in terror. No. Ryan stepped closer. What? Walter slowly backed away from the building. They weren't talking to me. They were talking about us. At that exact moment, the rusted steel door on the front of the abandoned building creaked open by itself. A cold fluorescent glow spilled across the forest floor. And from somewhere deep inside the darkness beyond the doorway, a calm human voice echoed through the night. "You're late." Then, after a brief pause, it spoke again. This time, it addressed each of them by name. Ryan's flashlight trembled in his hand. The beam settled on the rusted steel door, but the light seemed to vanish the moment it crossed the threshold. Instead of illuminating the interior, it was swallowed by an endless darkness that shouldn't have existed inside a building. The voice came again. Calm. Professional. Almost welcoming. Ryan Carter. A pause. Emily Brooks. Another pause. Sarah Collins. Mark Evans. Noah Walker. Finally, Walter Hayes. The old man staggered backward. His knees nearly gave out. "No," he whispered. "It remembers me." The fluorescent light inside the building flickered once. Twice. Then stabilized into a cold, sterile glow. For the first time, they could see beyond the doorway. A long concrete hallway stretched into the mountain. The walls were lined with peeling white paint. Rust streaked down from broken pipes in the ceiling. Old wheelchairs lay overturned in the corners. Metal doors stood open on either side of the corridor. At the very end of the hallway, a red exit sign still glowed. It was impossible. No building abandoned for decades should still have electricity. Ryan looked at the others. "We don't have many options." Emily stared at the forest behind them. The darkness between the trees had changed again. It wasn't empty anymore. Far beyond the tree line, hundreds of pale figures stood perfectly still. Watching. Waiting. They made no attempt to approach the building. Instead, they remained just outside the clearing, as though an invisible boundary prevented them from coming closer. Sarah noticed it too. "They're afraid." Walter slowly shook his head. "They're not afraid. They're waiting." "For what?" Walter looked toward the open doorway. "For us to go inside." Silence followed. Noah swallowed. "If they want us inside, maybe that's exactly where we shouldn't go." Ryan nodded. "I agree." He turned away from the entrance. "We'll go around it." The moment he took his first step toward the forest, every creature among the trees screamed simultaneously. The sound was so violent that birds exploded from the canopy for the first time since entering the wilderness. Ryan stopped immediately. The screaming ceased. He cautiously stepped back toward the building. Silence. He looked at Emily. "They're hurting us." Mark couldn't stop staring at the old facility. His curiosity slowly overcame his fear. He raised the camera once more. "I'm just going to zoom in." Ryan grabbed his arm. "Don't. It's only a picture." Mark gently pulled away. "I need evidence." He focused the lens on the hallway. The camera autofocus searched for several seconds. Then locked. Mark frowned. "What?" The hallway looked empty to their eyes. Through the camera. It wasn't. Dozens of people stood inside. Doctors. Nurses. Security guards. Scientists wearing white laboratory coats. They moved naturally through the corridor as though the building were fully operational. Some pushed medical carts. Others carried clipboards. A pair of technicians rolled a large steel container past one of the open rooms. None of them acknowledged the hikers. It was as if the camera had begun recording another moment in time. A moment decades in the past. Emily slowly looked from the camera screen to the actual hallway. The corridor before them remained abandoned. Dusty. Silent. Empty. Only the camera revealed the impossible activity. Mark whispered. "It's showing us the past." Walter stared at the screen. "No." His voice trembled. "It's showing us? What's still happening?" The image suddenly shifted. Every person inside the building stopped moving. At exactly the same moment. Doctors froze beside patients. Nurses halted in mid-step. Security guards stopped blinking. Then, slowly, every head turned toward the camera. Every face looked directly at Mark. The entire hallway became motionless. Hundreds of eyes stared from the tiny screen. One elderly scientist stepped forward. His lips moved. Although the camera had no audio playback, everyone heard his voice. Not through the speaker. Inside their heads. "Subject 6 has returned." Walter gasped. "No. The scientist continued. Containment breach remains active. Another figure appeared beside him. A woman wearing an identification badge. She smiled warmly. Almost kindly. Then she spoke. Welcome back, Walter. The camera abruptly shut itself off. Walter's breathing became rapid. His hands shook so violently he could barely remain standing. I remember. Ryan stepped closer. What do you remember? Walter stared blankly into the hallway. I lied. Everyone fell silent. I didn't come here to fish. No one interrupted him. He continued in a hollow voice. I worked here. The words echoed through the clearing. Emily blinked. What? I was maintenance. I repaired generators. I fixed electrical systems. I knew every hallway in this place. Ryan frowned. Then why don't you remember? Walter closed his eyes. They erased it. A cold breeze drifted from inside the building. They told us it was for national security. They said nobody could remember what happened underground. Sarah whispered. Underground? Walter nodded. This building, he slowly pointed toward the mountain behind it, is only the entrance. The fluorescent lights flickered again. One by one, more lights illuminated farther down the corridor. Then another. And another. It was as though the entire underground complex was waking up after decades of sleep. A metallic announcement echoed through unseen speakers. The voice was distorted by age. Attention all personnel. Static. Containment level 4 has failed. More static. All staff report immediately to. The message dissolved into loud interference. Then returned. Only this time. The announcement wasn't directed at employees. It was directed at the hikers. Ryan. Static. Emily. Static. Sarah. Static. Mark. Static. Noah. A pause. Then, replacement subjects required. Every light inside the building suddenly turned blood red. Deep beneath the mountain, something massive struck a steel door. The impact echoed through the foundation like an earthquake. Boom. Dust rained from the ceiling. Another impact. Boom. The steel walls groaned. Whatever was imprisoned far below wasn't merely alive. It was trying to escape. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Walter's face became completely devoid of color. He took one terrified step backward. Then another. His voice was barely audible. They never captured the creatures outside. He looked toward the dark forest where the faceless beings still waited. They were trying to keep something else from getting out. A third impact shook the mountain. This one was followed by the unmistakable sound of twisting metal. Far below the abandoned research station, a gigantic reinforced door had finally begun to open. The steel door groaned one final time. Then, silence. Not the silence of an empty forest. Not the silence that follows fear. This was something far older. It was the silence of a predator that no longer needed to hide. A deep vibration rolled through the mountain beneath their feet. Cracks spread across the concrete floor of the abandoned research station, while dust drifted from the ceiling like gray snow. The blood-red emergency lights flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Ryan tightened his grip on the flare gun. Emily stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the dark corridor. Sarah whispered a prayer. Mark continued recording, knowing the footage would probably never be seen by another living soul. Walter slowly closed his eyes. It's awake. A sound echoed from somewhere far below. Not a roar. Not a scream. A single footstep. Heavy enough to shake the entire mountain. Another followed. Closer. The lights failed one by one, plunging sections of the hallway into darkness. The footsteps continued. Slow. Measured. Patient. Whatever had been imprisoned beneath Cranberry Wilderness wasn't rushing toward them. It already knew they couldn't escape. Ryan looked toward the entrance. The forest. The faceless creatures were gone. Every single one of them. The clearing outside stood empty beneath a blanket of drifting fog. For the first time since entering the wilderness, there was no sign of the towering beings. Walter gave a bitter smile. They've already run. No one spoke. If those creatures feared whatever was underground, then humanity had never stood a chance. The final fluorescent light exploded overhead. Darkness swallowed the hallway. A low growl emerged from somewhere only a few feet away. Mark instinctively aimed his camera toward the sound. The infrared display activated. For one impossible second, the screen captured a silhouette unlike anything they had encountered before. It was enormous. Its body seemed to shift constantly, refusing to hold a single shape. Hundreds of pale hands reached from its surface before melting back into blackness. Dozens of faces appeared across its skin, each frozen in silent terror. Some looked centuries old. Others looked frighteningly familiar. One of them was Noah's. Another was Walter's. Then Ryan's. Emily's. Sarah's. Mark's. As though the creature already knew exactly what they would become. The camera screen shattered without warning. The lens cracked from the inside. The image vanished forever. Noah slowly realized something that made his blood run cold. The screams they had followed through the forest had never belonged to victims. They were echoes. Echoes of every person the thing beneath the mountain had ever consumed. The faceless creatures outside had not been hunting hikers. They had been guards. Wardens. Keeping curious travelers away from a prison humanity had forgotten existed. And now, because 6 frightened people had followed a cry for help into the wilderness, the prison door had finally opened. The last thing Ryan remembered was a pair of brilliant white eyes opening in the darkness. Not 2. Hundreds. Watching. Waiting. Then every flashlight, every emergency light, and every remaining source of illumination died at once. The mountain became completely black. The recording recovered weeks later from Mark's broken camera ended there. No bodies were ever found. No backpacks. No campsite. No abandoned research station. Search and rescue teams combed Cranberry Wilderness for nearly 3 weeks before officially suspending the operation. Their report concluded that the 5 hikers, and the unidentified elderly man who did not exist in any modern government database, had likely become disoriented and succumbed to the harsh wilderness. But some of the rescuers quietly admitted something they refused to include in the official report. On the final night of the search, every radio in the command camp picked up the same transmission. It lasted exactly 17 seconds. There was no static. No interference. Only the desperate voices of 6 people crying for help from somewhere deep within the forest. Their identities were unmistakable. Ryan. Emily. Sarah. Mark. Noah. Walter. The search teams followed the screams for nearly a mile. Then the voices abruptly stopped. Their GPS units failed. Their compasses spun without direction. And when they finally found their way back to camp, every clock they carried had advanced exactly 28 years. To this day, hikers who venture too deep into Cranberry Wilderness still tell the same story. On windless autumn nights, when the forest falls unnaturally quiet, a desperate human voice sometimes echoes between the mountains. It always sounds close. It always begs for help. And no matter where you're standing, it always seems to know your name. So if you ever find yourself alone beneath the ancient trees of Cranberry Wilderness, and you hear someone screaming in the distance, remember the warning carved into that weathered trailhead. Don't follow the screams. Because they may not be calling for help. They may be calling for you.